Good evening, visitors, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name is Gerard Pratt, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Navy is Commander Gary White. Tomorrow marks the commencement of a new sitting year for the 47th Parliament of Australia. We pause here in the commemorative area of the Australian War Memorial and reflect on the freedoms afforded to us as Australians. Freedoms underpinned by those who serve and those who have served our nation in the Australian Defence Force. At the opposite end of Anzac Parade from the Parliament, this institution and the stories it tells remind us of what it means to be an Australian, committed to one another and to this nation. Here with us this evening are the men and women elected by Australians to make those decisions that build and protect our nation, including the deployment of members of the Australian Defence Force across the globe. The roll of honour cloaking us reminds us of the cost of those decisions, as does the physical and emotional toll on those who have served. As the members of the Parliament commence the sitting period, your presence here speaks to every Australian of the deep responsibility to never forget individual sacrifices made in our name, devotion to duty and to our country. In speaking of service to the nation, the Council, staff and volunteers of the Australian War Memorial would like to take a moment to express our deep sadness at the recent passing of veteran and retired Major General, the former Senator Jim Molan. We will remember his distinguished service of 40 years with the Australian Army and his tireless work as an advocate for our veterans. We extend our deepest condolences to his family, his parliamentary colleagues, and to all those with whom he served. Shortly, we will hear the story of Lieutenant Stanley Le Fevre, who lost his life while serving Australia in the First World War, and warmly welcome his family members who are with us here this evening. We're honoured to acknowledge the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Peter Dutton, Leader of the Federal Opposition, and all members and senators of the 47th Parliament of Australia who are joining us here this evening. We're also honoured to acknowledge Vice Chief of the Defence Force, Vice Admiral David Johnson, representing the Chief of the Defence Force, and other members of the Australian Defence Force. The Honourable Kim Beazley, Chair of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, accompanied by Ms Susie Ennis, and Mr Matt Anderson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. As always, we welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. The live stream of this ceremony is made possible by the Returned and Services League of Australia and the RSL and Services Clubs Association. We welcome members who are watching this broadcast from across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by family and guests of the memorial. Australia's Federation Guard is the tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catafalque party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. I would now like to invite the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister of Australia, to the lectern.
The light of this day will soon yield to darkness, just as sound will yield to silence, just as life will, ultimately, yield to death. And as that darkness falls, we will think of them, all of them who now belong to the great silence. Look about you. All around us in this secular temple are the names of the dead and the places they fell. Try to imagine the face that belonged to every name. The voice, maybe the laugh or the light in their eyes, maybe the distinctive footstep along country street or city lane. Imagine the promise of every one of those lives, everything they might have been, everything they might have done. Then imagine every shockwave from that death, every wave of grief that swept through a family, a community. To look at those names is, in its way, a sombre astronomy. We see these names before us, blazing brightly like stars arrayed in their constellations. But in order to truly see, we have to look harder, with our eyes, and yes, with our hearts, and imagine everybody in that star's orbit. The loved ones, the spouses, the children, the parents, the ones who learned by telegram that the great light in their lives had been extinguished, the ones who heard that knock on the door, the ones who were left to write words for a gravestone they knew they would never see. Expressions of loss and heartache. Sometimes an entire universe of loss held within just a few words, such as the message from William Henry O'Bree's parents for his headstone at Gallipoli. It reads simply, "We miss him at home." Then think of all the ones who have never found out, who never knew with absolute certainty, the ones who were left haunted by an absence but were never granted that one small consolation of closure. Just as we think of those who fell and were delivered into that final silence and those they left behind, we also think of those who came home, those who came back from war and thrived, those who came back from war but couldn't. Those who came back changed, their old selves forever left on some distant shore or upon the turbulent sea. We must also acknowledge those we went to war in our name, who did their duty in our name, but whose names we did not hold up so proudly. 50 years after the role of Australian troops in the hostilities in Vietnam came to an end, let us again acknowledge them. Let us say to every one of our Vietnam veterans, we honour you, we thank you, and we are so sorry it took us so long as a nation to do so. And we say that just as we say it to all who served, but did not feel the gratitude of the nation or have their honour proudly recorded in the history books. We say it to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander soldiers who fought for their homeland overseas. Just as we honour those who fell, we honour the veterans who stand amongst us. Just as they stepped up for us, and just as all serving members of the Australian Defence Force step up for us now, we must step up for them. We offer gratitude and respect to all who serve, all who have served in our name. We honour you with the last post in its simplicity and its power. We honour you with the flowers of the forest, a lament that, even with the weight of its sorrow, soars towards the dead. And within those notes, in all their grace, in all their ache, and all their yearning, we listen for your voices, lest we forget.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I would now like to invite the Honourable Peter Dutton, Leader of the Federal Opposition, to the lectern.
Prime Minister, Chair of the Australian War Memorial Council, Kim Beazley, Kim, this is my first public opportunity to acknowledge your appointment to this auspicious position, and you and Susie have served our country with great distinction for many, many decades, this just the latest. To the Director of the Australian War Memorial, Matt Anderson, to the Vice Chief of the Defence Force, Vice Admiral David Johnston, to the Chief of the Army, Lieutenant General Simon Stewart, Chief of the Air Force, Air Marshal Robert Chipman, Chief of Joint Capabilities, Lieutenant General John Fruin, the Deputy Chief of Navy, Rear Admiral Jonathan Early, and the Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs, Alison Frame. Members of the Australian Defence Force, defence officials, veterans and their families, parliamentary colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, one and all, good afternoon. Each year, thousands of children walk through the doors of our National War Memorial. They do so holding the hand of a parent or standing in line with a teacher in the lead. For adults, there is something special in observing children in this sacred place. Their minds are engrossed in their surroundings. Their eyes are captivated by what they see. Whether it's the bronze panels of the Roll of Honour with red poppies affixed to names, the vaulting dome of the Hall of Memory containing the tomb of the unknown soldier, the bullet-ridden landing boats salvaged from the shores of Gallipoli, the halls containing tanks, aircraft and even a midget submarine, and exhibitions filled with dioramas, uniforms, small arms, photographs, medals, letters and diaries. Young children often can't fully understand the context behind these relics and monuments. Yet for those children who wander this memorial for the first time, it is a moment of awakening as they begin to sense the weight of history, to appreciate the meaning of duty, to grasp the scale of national sacrifice. It is the end of innocence for many and the first step towards adulthood. For adults, there is also something poignant in seeing this transformation. Children walk away from this place stimulated, engaged and wanting to learn more, to better understand what happened, why Australians served and what they did. This year we commemorate two significant military anniversaries. 70 years since the signing of the armistice which ended the Korean War, and 50 years since Australia concluded its involvement in the Vietnam War. Taking place in the shadow of the Second World War, the Korean War has regrettably been called the Forgotten War. Historian Max Hastings said that many veterans returned home to discover that their experience was of no interest whatsoever to their fellow countrymen. That Korea was seen as only a running sore, belatedly cauterised in July of 1953. If Korea was the first major hot conflict of the Cold War, then Vietnam became another ideological battleground between capitalism and communism, between democracy and dictatorship. Far from being labelled as a forgotten war like Korea, Vietnam is remembered as a controversial and polarising war. It produced public antipathy and protest, especially due to conscription. Historian Geoffrey Blaney said that the Australians fighting in Vietnam felt the sting of public apathy and derision, that they came under emotional attack from a section of their own community as they risked their lives. As we know, both wars were bloody, hard fought, and exacted a terrible human cost to all involved. In Korea, of the 17,000 Australians who served, more than 1,200 were wounded and 340 killed. In Vietnam, of the 60,000 Australians who served, more than 3,000 were wounded and 523 killed. There are many lessons which have come from the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Strategic lessons, military lessons and social lessons. This year, as we commemorate the significant anniversaries to mark the end of both conflicts, more children will discover, and some rediscover, this National War Memorial. Perhaps we can tell them two things about the Korean War and the Vietnam War. We can tell them that many Australian veterans who returned home from Korea and Vietnam were not treated in a manner befitting their service and sacrifice. Let us play our part in ensuring that future generations never ever repeat the mistakes of the past. We can also tell our children that Australians stood with our allies to support those who desired self-determination and liberty against those hell-bent on conquest. Let us play our part in ensuring that future generations never become indifferent towards defending the noble cause of freedom. Yes, Korea ended in a stalemate, Vietnam in defeat, but decades on from the end of both conflicts we see a different picture. Today, satellite images of Korea at night show an illuminated south in contrast to a darkened north. Today, Vietnam and Australia share a close and deepening relationship and shared commitment to maintaining peace in our region. The service and sacrifice of our forebears was not in vain. The values for which we stand are more enduring than any conflict. As long as we have, like our forebears, the courage and commitment to defend them always, lest we forget.
Thank you, Mr. Dutton. If you're able, please stand and join in singing the national anthem. If you're able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through until the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 103,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection in the following order. The family of Lieutenant Stanley Le Fevre. The family of Lieutenant Stanley Le Fevre. The Honourable Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister of Australia, and the Honourable Peter Dutton, Leader of the Federal Opposition. Senator, the Honourable Sue Lyons, President of the Senate, and the Honourable Milton Dick, Speaker of the House of Representatives. The Honourable Pat Conroy, Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence, and the Honourable Andrew Hastie, Shadow Minister for Defence. The Honourable Matt Keogh, Minister for Veterans Affairs and Minister for Defence Personnel, and the Honourable Barnaby Joyce, Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs. The Honourable Matt Thistlethwaite, Assistant Minister for Defence and Assistant Minister for Veterans Affairs, and Mr Philip Thompson, Shadow Assistant Minister for Defence. The Vice Chief of the Defence Force, Vice Admiral David Johnston, representing the Chief of the Defence Force. Brigadier Philip Winter, representing the National President of the Returned and Services League of Australia, and Legatee Eric Easterbrook, Chairman of Legacy Australia. The Honourable Kim Beazley, Chair of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Mr Matt Anderson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. And the final wreaths will be laid by guests of the memorial.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Lieutenant Stanley Le Fevre. Stanley Le Fevre was born on the 24th of November 1896 in Pinegana, Tasmania, the son of pioneer and dairy farmer James Le Fevre and his wife Jessie. The second youngest of 14 children, Stanley received his education at the local Pinegana school. He later moved to Melbourne to study accountancy at Stotts Business College and Hemingway and Robertson's Accountancy School. Stanley later took took up employment as a clerk with Massey Harris Agricultural Machinery Company. When war broke out in 1914, Stanley attempted to enlist but was too young and was rejected due to his age and the condition of his teeth. As restrictions for enlistment were relaxed, he again tried to enlist on the 27th of September 1915, giving his age as 23. He was successful and was allocated to the 39th Battalion before spending several months training in Ballarat. Lefevre embarked from Melbourne on board the troop ship Ascanius in May 1916. He arrived in England in July, where he underwent further training before heading to the School of Instruction at Chelsea Barracks in late September. On the 7th of October, he obtained a commission, becoming lieutenant. After joining his unit in France in December 1916, Lefevre's first major action with his battalion was at the Battle of Messines. The Allies were attempting to capture Messines-White-Scartup Bridge, which was an essential to plans to take and occupy the Belgian coastline. The attack was preceded by a 7-day bombardment. During the bombardment, Lefevre was commended by his commanding officer for rescuing a wounded Australian who was involved in a raiding party on German lines. In broad daylight, Lefevre ran 50 yards into no man's land and carried the wounded man to safety, risking his life to do so. During the Battle of Messines, Lefevre's division were attacked by phosgene gas. Stanley Le Fevre was among more than 500 men who were incapacitated and hospitalised. Lefevre was sent to hospital in England, where he spent several months recovering before returning to France in late September. Lefevre was able to return to normal duties, but spent the rest of his military career in and out of hospital with ongoing health issues. Lefevre's next major action was at the Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August 1918, where the Allies were attempting to throw all of their resources at the enemy and turn the tide of the war. Lefevre was commanding his company around the French village of La Flaque on the 10th of August during attempts to capture Proyart. They came under heavy machine gun fire during their advance. He was again gassed by the enemy, but continued to lead his men despite being almost incapacitated himself. By the end of the Battle of Amiens, the Allies had taken more than 29,000 prisoners and had liberated 116 towns, making it one of the most successful offences of the war. In late August, Lefevre's battalion advanced towards the French village of Curlot. Lefevre was resting in a dugout with his comrades awaiting further orders when an enemy shell landed on their position. Lefevre and 2 of his comrades were killed instantly. 2 other soldiers died of wounds the following day. Stanley Le Fevre was just 20 years old and only months away from the end of the war. After his death, Lefevre was awarded the Military Cross for his actions at La Flaque on the 10th and 11th of August 1918. In recommending him for the award, his commanding officers said, "He displayed great initiative and resource, leading his company with utter disregard to his own personal safety. The gallant conduct of Lieutenant Lefevre undoubtedly saved the lives of many of the company on our left and saved what promised to be the most difficult situation. His conduct generally was beyond all praise." In Australia, Lefevre's family produced a memorial card containing a poem which read, "We mourn your loss, dear Stan, but your actions sweet balm to the loved ones bring, for he's ever a hero, the man who dies for his country, God and King. We think of your life and duty done, too dearly loved to ever be forgotten." His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my right amongst 62,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. His photograph is displayed today by the Pool of Reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Lieutenant Stanley Le Fevre, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
If able, please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
Thou shalt not grow old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli with his poor tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the Last Post ceremony. On behalf of the Director, staff and volunteers, thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support of the Memorial's development project. We wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you.